Begin in the dark before dawn, where history is usually quiet. Sinhand reaches for a switch. A bulb clicks on in a cramped room that smells like wet wool and cold coffee. There's a map on the wall, its surface pocked by thumbtacks, strings, and pencil scars. You can hear rain tapping the window and the muffled breath of men who've been awake too long. This is where some of the most decisive moments of the Second World War actually happened. In rooms like this, with names you don't know yet, and people who didn't ask to be remembered. Tonight, we're going to remember them. Let's start with a voice that changed a day that changed a continent. NTHE Room is in England, June 1944. Group Captain James Stagg, a Scottish meteorologist with a quiet way of standing, lays out a forecast that nobody wants. Wind, low cloud, cross seas, terrible for invasion craft, disastrous for paratroopers. The admirals and generals frown as if they could discipline weather into obedience. Stagg is unromantic, precise. He points to a brief window, 24 hours later, when the sky and sea might behave just enough. It's not courage with medals. It's courage with data. Eisenhower listens. He senses the calm inside Stagg's certainty and moves D-Day by a day. You know the beaches by name. Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword. You know the photographs of soldiers stepping into cold surf. What you might not know is that their odds improved because a man in a sweater convinced the largest armada in history to wait. There are soldiers with rifles in the frame. There's also a soldier with a barometer just outside it. He is one of the overlooked, and he turned the tide, literally, now across the ocean, to an island where words became armor. A marine radio sits in the sand, antenna twitching in wind. Shells thump somewhere you don't want to look. Two men crouch behind black lava rock. One speaks a language almost no one on that beach understands. The other watches the horizon with a rifle balanced on his knee. "Send it," the rifleman says. The Navajo code talker leans into the handset. His syllables are quick, exact, and beautiful. Within seconds, artillery walks across a ridge like a steel curtain being pulled. A unit that could have been cut to ribbons advances instead. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima. The pattern repeats. The code is built on a language that was nearly beaten out of classrooms back home. Now it moves faster than any machine cipher. No enemy cryptographer can unwind it in time to matter. Messages that once took hours take minutes. Minutes become yards. Yards become lives. These men wear the same uniforms as everyone else. They carry the same weight. But when they speak, whole operations move with them. You hear later that one general called them indispensable. The general was right, but indispensable is too cold. They were the difference between chaos and choreography, and that difference wins islands. From the Pacific, step into a cathedral where courage made a stand that crowds a room even when it's empty. In Prague, 1942. A tram rattles by. Sunlight chips off a sedan's fender. Two men, Jan Kubis and Josef Gabčík, Czechoslovak paratroopers trained in Britain, wait at a curve. The target is Reinhard Heydrich, one of the most feared men in Europe. The Sten gun jams. The world holds its breath for a second that feels like a grave opening. Kubis throws a modified grenade. The explosion rips metal and glass. Heydrich is wounded in ways pride cannot outvote. Infection finishes what courage began. The assassins run, then hide beneath a church. The hunt is relentless. The siege is terrible. They fight in a crypt that echoes with gunfire and prayer. When the bullets run out, they choose their own ending. This is not a clean victory. The reprisals are monstrous. Villages erased, families erased with them. And still, the world learns something. The apparatus of terror can be cut. The blade is not always a battalion. Sometimes it's a pair of men on bicycles who decide that impossible is a word for other people. They are soldiers of a nation in exile. They don't look like a turning of the tide. They are one. Now, let rubber become steel and art become order of battle. France, late 1944. A convoy rolls down a hedgerow lane. From the air, it looks like tanks and guns. Up close, it smells like paint and canvas. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the Ghost Army, parks inflatable Shermans in fields and strings, fake tracks through mud. They angle speakers the size of truck beds toward the night and play a symphony of deception. Engines idling, clanks, shouted orders, bridge timbers thudding under boots. Radio operators mimic the gossip of headquarters so convincingly that eavesdroppers swear they can smell coffee in the wires. German scouts report what they see and hear. The enemy shifts brigades toward phantoms. Real divisions slip the net and cross somewhere else. At the Rhine, sound and shadow pull attention to the wrong bank, while engineers build a real bridge in the right darkness. The war is saved in yards. The Ghost Army buys yards by the mile. When the shooting stops, many of them will become designers, illustrators, and teachers. They'll keep quiet about the nights they made air feel heavy. History loves big machines. It should leave flowers for the men who weaponized make-believe. Now to an airfield soaked with tea, oil, and rain. The roar is familiar. The accents are not. Summer 1940, the Battle of Britain is an argument between fuel and nerve. Hurricanes and Spitfires leap into cloud. Among them, No. 303 Polish Squadron, pilots who escaped one occupied country only to defend another. They fly hard, close, and fast. They don't waste ammunition. They don't waste time. Many learn to fight in skies with no mercy. Now they turn those lessons into streaks of fire against Heinkels and Dorniers. In a few frantic weeks, they claim scores that look like typing errors. Ground crews, Polish and British, work like surgeons under rain, swapping engines, patching holes, scrounging parts from yesterday's wreck to keep today's fighter angry. When it ends, London still stands. The invasion doesn't come. The official tallies are dry and cautious. The memory of those who watched the contrails isn't. Ask an old mechanic who bore the weight of wing roots with his shoulder so a jack could be placed, and he'll tell you. The margin was thin as paper. The fingers that thickened it belonged to men whose homes were behind wire and far away. Step south into the desert, where distance itself becomes a weapon. Bir Hakeim, 1942. A square of waste sand fortified by Free French forces, legionnaires, colonial troops from across Africa and the Pacific, Jewish volunteers from the Mandate, men with 5 languages between them and one job in common. Hold. Rommel expects them to fold like canvas in a gust. They do not. For 16 days, the box refuses to die. Guns change barrels until they glow. Ambulances explode and get replaced by stretchers. When the order finally comes to break out, the column punches through minefields and machine gun fire in columns that look suicidal until they work. The time they bought lets the British 8th Army step back, breathe, and set its feet for the fights that will come. It's easy to remember the names that topped communiques. It's harder to remember the men whose names filled paybooks from Brazzaville, Dakar, Beirut, Tahiti, who stood in a square so a continent could pivot. They were overlooked on purpose sometimes. Don't repeat the mistake. Safime from desert to mountains, to a monastery that watched centuries and then watched war. Monte Cassino, 1944. The air tastes of chalk and cordite. The slopes are steep enough to make you think about prayer in practical terms. Polish Second Corps moves up under fire that feels biblical. The task is cruel. Take a ridge that eats battalions. The men climb anyway. Gurkhas carve paths with hands and boots. New Zealanders, Indians, British, French North Africans, Italians who changed sides. All of them have been bleeding on these stones for months. The final lift is Polish. They reach the abbey's broken walls and raise a flag on stones that remember Benedict. What turned the tide here wasn't just weight. It was persistence with many faces, mule drivers coaxing beasts where trucks gave up, sappers cutting paths where maps lied, stretcher bearers turning themselves into human winches. When the monastery is finally quiet, the road to Rome is open. And in the ledger, new names appear, names from villages that don't appear on most maps, carried by men who grew old with bad knees and good memories, of a day when skies refused to help and they won anyway. Across the world, to jungle where the air itself feels like an enemy and the hills have eyes that want you to fall. And Burma, 1944. Imphal and Kohima. The road is a scar carved out of green. Supplies reach forward by grit, rope, and faith. Indian Army units hold ridges with foxholes that flood every afternoon. Naga tribesmen move like rumors through forest, guiding columns along paths only they can see, telling officers what the jungle plans. Gurkha patrols sleep in rain and wake with leeches and no complaints. On a tennis court at Kohima, lines still marked for a game nobody has time to play. Men fight across baselines and service boxes, lobbing grenades instead of balls. Logistics decides who starves. Air supply decides who gets to argue with logistics. Pilots thread valleys at treetop height to shove bundles out the door and hope the wind behaves. Victory here looks like a slow turn. A siege broken, a road reopened, an army that thought it could live on air learning it could not. The men who did it are not on poster walls. Their medals mostly stayed in drawers. But ask any historian where Japan's expansion began to die on the ground, and he'll circle these hills. Under the circles live overlooked soldiers whose maps were in their heads and whose courage wore mud. Now to Italy again, but on a slope with a name that sounds like a song until you climb it. Monte Castello, winter 1944-45. Snow, rock, and a wind that files your bones. The Brazilian Expeditionary Force, the Smoking Cobras, a nickname they chose as a joke at their own expense, sets its shoulder against a ridge the Germans do not plan to gift. They learn the mountain quickly. They learn artillery etiquette and the humor of field kitchens. They take the hill one bite at a time. Months later, they will parade past jeeps and cameras they didn't come for, carrying a flag that had never flown in a European war. Almost none of them had seen snow before they saw it mixed with blood. They still move the line and slide north to the Vosges, where the woods feel closer than they are, and the fog makes you believe in ghosts. October 1944. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, Japanese-American infantry whose families are behind barbed wire back home, gets an order no one wants: break through and rescue a trapped battalion. The ground is soaked. The enemy is dug in. The word impossible hovers at mouth level. They move anyway, hill by hill, tree by tree. The rescue happens because they refuse any ending that isn't a handshake between exhausted men. The cost is cruel. The ledger shows two columns: lives saved, lives spent. The second is heavier. The first matters anyway. When the war ends, the unit will be the most decorated for its size and length of service. That's a statistic. In the forest, it felt like a series of decisions to go forward when the body wanted to lie down. We're not done. We haven't talked about the sappers who turned Stalingrad's basements into front lines with pickaxes and wire. Or the Soviet women pilots who slipped across the night in plywood biplanes and made German soldiers call them witches, which is another word for "we cannot stop them." We haven't mentioned the merchant mariners who cross the North Atlantic in ships that creak like old houses while submarines circle like wolves, or the Italian partisans who turned railroads into stutters, or the Chinese guerrillas who taught themselves to count ambushes instead of hours. NBUT. We will pause at midway, because sometimes the overlooked soldier works in a basement with headphones and pencils. Spring 1942. Station Hypo, Pearl Harbor. Joseph Rochefort and a handful of codebreakers are sanding a wall of numbers until their fingers bleed data. Japanese communications refer to a target called AF. Rochefort suggests telling Midway to report a breakdown of its water plant in the clear. If the Japanese mention AF being short of water, you have your answer. They do. The enemy's plan unfolds like a map, just enough to matter. Admiral Nimitz hides carriers in the ocean's creases. Torpedo squadrons go bravely into the mouth of hell and don't come out. Dive bombers arrive above decks clogged with fuel hoses and bombs and find the war's coincidence and arithmetic finally on their side. NTHE tide turns in minutes drawn by men who never saw the sunlight that day. Those men smoked too much, slept too little, and moved a fleet with a word that wasn't supposed to mean anything on its own. Water. Before we end this first part, step into a factory where victory grows one bolt at a time. A woman sets a rivet with a gun that kicks her wrist in a way she will feel 20 years later when it rains. A man with a stammer reads a gauge twice and signs once because he has learned that signatures are bones and must be placed carefully. A foreman counts tail numbers in chalk and notices a mismatch before a bomber taxis. A black welder in Alabama draws a perfect bead in a yard where thanks come slow, and a ship that would have cracked holds together in a winter sea. None of them will be on a newsreel. All of them will be in a ledger labeled "Things that didn't fail when asked." What turns tides? Not just brilliant plans. Not just loud victories. A tide turns when 1,000 small decisions lean in the same direction at the exact second the wave hesitates. We've walked through beaches, jungles, deserts, and skies, looking for names that hide under larger names. In Part 2, we'll go deeper into a few of these battles, follow single threads you can hold in your hand, and watch how they pull a whole tapestry tight. We'll hear how a forecast saved paratroopers from the wrong clouds, how a code from the canyons moved ships, how rubber disguised as steel misled divisions, how language once punished became a shield, how hilltop arithmetic saved a regiment, how mountains were taken by men who had never seen snow, and how a warehouse clerk with a pencil did as much for victory as a general with a pen. Because if there's a single truth about overlooked soldiers, it's this: when we finally look, we find them everywhere, and the war changes shape under our eyes. And begin with the map again, and the man who asked the sea to wait. And James Stagg stands at the head of the table with the posture of someone who knows his words won't be loved and must be said anyway. He doesn't sell them, he sets them down. Pressure gradients, isobars, the way a front will sag, the way wind will shear off drop zones and turn parachutes into blind kites. The admirals argue their duty, convoys are loaded, beachmasters are ready, the moon won't take another request. Stagg's voice is steady, gently stubborn. Postpone. 24 hours. NTHE room breathes through teeth. Eisenhower's eyes move across faces that will carry the order to thousands. Then the decision. We go on the 5th. The weather breaks just enough. Paratroopers jump into rough air, not impossible air. Landing craft grind through a mean sea, not a murderous one. Men die. That part never changes. But the invasion holds. The most photographed day of the war owes one quiet man with a pencil and the nerve to say no to the calendar. There are statues to generals. There should be a little brass plaque on a barometer. Now hear a radio voice that turned islands from graves into stepping stones. On Saipan the sand burns, the air tastes of TNT dust, and a Navajo Marine kneels in a scrape no wider than a door. His partner watches the tree line. The handset clicks hot in the caller's palm. Words pour, fast, exact, eagles for bombers, turtles for tanks, besh hello for iron fish. A fire mission tightens like a fist. Enemy guns go silent because they don't have the luxury of understanding. Intense later, officers try to explain what happened on paper. Traffic volume doubled, errors almost none, security absolute. Those are tidy words. The messy truth is that a language nearly erased by policy became a shield for men who would not have lived without it. They wrote a chapter nobody could read unless they were invited. It saved lives by the minute. And carry that gravity to Prague, where two bicycles coast to a turn that has no forgiveness in it, and Gabasik Sten chokes on a spring. Kubis throws his device, and the car jolts into history. The operation ripples, gunfire in the street, hideouts, betrayals, boots on stairwells, a crypt flooded with bullets and water and prayer. The price is savage. Entire villages are turned into ash and memory. The men in the crypt die on their own terms. That is not victory in a parade sense. But it breaks the illusion that the occupation is made of iron. The world registers pain and defiance at the same volume. In a war of symbols as much as statistics, that matters. Somewhere in a file, a line changes from impossible to costly. Costly can be paid. The resistance takes note. Now let the air itself become paint and the night a stage. A column of trucks rolls into a French village that will be empty of soldiers by morning. It's full anyway, of inflatable armor, fake command posts, and artists who learn to make shadows obey. The ghost army thunders with speakers and whispers with radios. "We need more clank on the West Road," someone says, and a sound engineer layers scrap metal on a phonograph and makes a panzer battalion walk where it isn't. Recon reports confirm enemy armor massing west. The real armor crosses east. Bridges fall into place under darkness nobody notices because they are staring at lamps that were placed precisely to be seen. It is the strangest kind of courage to go to the front unarmed and make the air dangerous. Many of them will never talk about it. Their reward is silence where gunfire might have been. Up into cloud now, where contrails unspool like chalk lines on a blackboard, and seconds are coins NNO. 303 Squadron, fueled by exile and tea, lunges into Me-109s with a ferocity that looks like recklessness until you read the gunnery logs. Tight bursts. Short ranges, engines hit, not wings. Parachutes bloom below. Ground crews hammer new cowls onto tired airframes in weather that tastes of tin. A young pilot sits on a crate, 5 cigarettes into a war he keeps living through. "We go again," somebody says. They do. A few weeks later, the numbers make a shape. Raids broken, formations scattered, bombers turning early. The Home Guard will still dig people out of rubble, but not as many. The invasion rehearsals across the channel become just that, rehearsals that never get a premiere. Few in London know the names in Polish script painted under canopies. It doesn't matter to those men. The sky knows. Back to the desert, where the wind sandpapers your eyelids and hope is rationed. Bir Hakeim holds. It holds when logic says it shouldn't. A Senegalese rifleman fires until his barrel smokes, then trades with a comrade whose French is different and perfect enough. A Free French artillery captain calls fire on his own wire because tanks are that close. A white kepi catches dust and sweat. The head under it plans the night breakout like a bank job. When the column punches through, headlights hooded, engines whispering, the desert does not help and does not hinder. The box lives because the men in it decided that squares can be circles if you push hard enough. Rommel writes a line in his diary that sounds like respect with grit in it. Later at El Alamein, time bought at Bir Hakeim will be spent with interest, and into the Apennines, to a ridge that stole breath and gave back graves. Monte Castello burns slowly in winter light. The Brazilian Expeditionary Force climbs in borrowed boots. They learn to read German artillery the way a fisherman reads swells. A breath, a pause, a slap. They move when the breath comes. Mule skinners cajole hooves over ice. Medics develop new languages made of gestures and wool. When the crest finally changes hands, it doesn't roar, it sighs. Orders run down the slope like warm water. The line moves. Nobody updates the posters back home. Carnival bands will do that later. For now, a ridge stops being a prison. Across a casino, where monks watched centuries and soldiers watched minutes. NTHE Final Assault is a concerto of national uniforms, none of them playing loudly enough alone. Polish Second Corps does the last, hardest climb. They inherit every mistake made before, and still find a way to lift flags onto stones that have seen Romans and earthquakes and now this. You can list the units involved, and you should. You can list the names, and you can't, not all of them. A mule that refused yesterday walks today. A sapper who has not slept since the thaw pulls a fuse with fingers he can barely feel. When it's done, the road to Rome opens like a fist unclenching. NS pin the globe to Burma, where the air sits on your shoulders and insects own the clock. Nymphal and Kohima are lessons in hunger and stubbornness. A sepoy boils tea black as oil and shares it with a Gurkha who will take a hill before dusk. Naga Scout's ghost through growth that swallows boots. On the tennis court, men dig foxholes in painted rectangles and fight point by point while the umpire chair burns. Air supply becomes religion. Pilots fly so low they can see faces. A packet of morphine falls into the right hands at the right minute, and an infection does not win. When the siege lifts, it doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like a fever breaking. But lines on maps soften and then redraw. The empire that advanced on shoestrings begins to trip over them, north again, Vosges forest, mist and pine, and orders that taste like iron. NTHE 440-second moves. Forward, then forward again, until forward means something else. A trench with faces you've never seen who will call you brother by noon. The Lost Battalion is not lost anymore. The after-action report is numbers and nouns. The truth is, 20-year-olds carrying 30-year-olds down slopes on shoulders that will never be the same. The truth is, a letter sent to a mother behind barbed wire saying her son's unit did glory while her mail says suspicion. The ledger is unkind, the debt is paid anyway. The forest learns a new language that day, gratitude without grammar. Turn the dials in a basement where victory was a crossword solved in ink. Rochefort's team breaks AF, and the ocean allows an ambush. The torpedo squadrons die brave, too brave for any theory to encompass. Dive bombers arrive from a height the enemy did not plan against. The carrier decks are tinder. In minutes, Kaga, Akagi, Soryu become names with smoke. The Japanese fleet loses a future. The Americans gain a present. The men who did it wear headphones that smell like old leather and sweat. Their reward is to keep working, to keep smoking, to keep missing sleep for a living. That living moves nations. Between all these thunderclaps, listen for the quieter music of supply. N.A. Riveter unpacks her lunch and eats on a crate because the shift horn owns her afternoon. A black machinist in a Jim Crow yard regrinds a tool bit to a whisper that makes 1,000 parts identical enough to behave like brothers. A farmer drives a new tractor and grows grain that will become rations that will become miles in Italy and France and Burma. A teacher organizes a scrap drive and her students learn that a tin can, flattened and counted, turns into a bolt that holds a landing craft together when waves insist otherwise. A merchant marine watches the wake for periscopes and pretends the shade of water means something other than chance. They are all soldiers in overalls, aprons, peacoats, whose battlefield is repetition. Without them, genius at the front is theater without props. Now, because the war is also made of messages, hear this one. A telegram clerk in a depot catches a routing error before it goes out. He takes 2 steps back, reads it again, and moves a slip to a different tray. A mother's son is not declared dead that day. He is declared wounded. She hates the second word less than the first. That is not strategy. That is mercy performed by a private with ink on his thumb. Now widen the lens. These overlooked soldiers, forecasters, code talkers, saboteurs, decoys, pilots from other skies, desert squares that refuse to fold, mountain climbers with rifles, jungle whispers, regiments that carried more than their weight, codebreakers, welders, riveters, sailors with nowhere to hide. What did they share? Small rooms, narrow windows, decisions that looked like errands when they were acts of war. None of them moved a flag alone. All of them bent a line together. NTHE endings are not neat. Some came home to parades that felt like dreams. Some came home to silence. Some did not come home. Some were thanked slowly or wrongly or not at all. Some spent the rest of their lives fixing toasters and roofs and marriages with the same stubborn competence that took a hill or held a radio net. When they told stories, they left out adjectives. When they kept quiet, it was because adjectives would have been unfair. NBUT, the tides they turned left, marks we can still read. And D-Day hits the right window and a continent gets a door. Saipan gets its curtain of fire and a timetable slides earlier. Heydrich is removed from the board and an occupation learns fear is not invincible. Divisions chase rubber tanks and real tanks go where they must. The Battle of Britain ends with London alive. Bir Hakeim buys El Alamein time, and El Alamein buys Egypt. Monte Castello and Cassino tear stitches in lines that were supposed to hold forever. Imphal and Kohima crack an empire's confidence. The Vosges Rescue writes duty with blood. Midway turns an ocean. The factories and shipyards and docks turn steel into seconds, and seconds into outcomes. NIF. You're looking for a single hero, you won't find one here. If you're looking for a single habit, you will. Ordinary people making careful choices when no one is watching. The ones who read weather as a sentence. The ones who treated a radio like a lifeline. The ones who turned art into armor. The ones who taught mountains to listen. The ones who trusted doubt over speed. The ones who learned the weight of a yes and loved the word no when it saved lives. History often writes in capital letters. These were lowercase victories, handwritten in pencil, smudged by rain and sweat, filed in drawers, stamped late, rediscovered by grandchildren. They're why the big letters spell what they do. NSO. Turn off the light in that small room. Put the pencil down. The map will be here in the morning. Somewhere, another quiet expert will have to make the weather obey as best it can. Somewhere, another language will be needed, fast and faithful. Somewhere, a hill that looks indifferent will suddenly care about the men climbing it because the men make it care. And if you pass a memorial, any memorial, read the names you know, then imagine the names missing. The forecast that steered a fleet, the voice that steered artillery, the decoy that steered divisions, the code that steered carriers, the weld that steered a ship through ice, the hand that steered a slip of paper into the right tray. They are all there, invisible but legible, if you know how to read weather maps and rivet lines and radio nets as paragraphs. NTHE tide turns quietly before it crashes. The crash gets the photograph. The quiet gets the world we live in. This has been their chapter. And as the rain thins on the window of that little room, and the bulb cools and the map rests, the truth is simple enough to keep NA,000 overlooked soldiers leaned in the same direction at the same second, and the war, slowly, stubbornly, finally, leaned with them.